This is part 27 of Angular 2 tutorial. In this video, we'll discuss how to call ASP.NET Web API service using the Angular built-in HTTP service. Though this example demonstrates calling an ASP.NET Web API service, we can use the same approach to call any web service built using any server-side technology. Along the way, we'll also briefly discuss what observable pattern is all about, and finally, issuing cross-domain service calls. This is the ASP.NET Web API service we built in our previous video. This Web API service retrieves data from this employees database table. At the moment, we have the employees data hard-coded within our Angular employee service, as you can see right here. Now, instead of hard-coding employees data within the application like this, we want this service to call the Web API service. The Web API service in turn retrieves data from the database table. So let's look at the steps involved for calling a server-side Web API service using the Angular built-in HTTP service. This HTTP service is present in a different Angular module, and that module is HTTP module. So the first step is to import this Angular HTTP module from our root application module, which is app module. So within this file right here, app.module.ts, we have our root application module, app module. Now here, let's import the HTTP module. So let's include the required import statement, and just like how we have included browser module and forms module as part of the imports array, let's also include the HTTP module. So with this change, we are now able to use the built-in Angular HTTP service to issue web service calls over HTTP. Here are the two changes which we just made. Our second step is to modify the Angular employee service to issue a GET request using the Angular built-in HTTP service. Our employee service is present in this file, employee.service.ts. Now, the first step here is to import HTTP from Angular HTTP. Here is the HTTP service, so we are going to make use of this service to issue web service calls over HTTP. So we now need to inject this HTTP service into our service class. For that, we are going to make use of the constructor. To create a constructor in TypeScript, we use the constructor keyword. Let's create a private field for the class, and I'm going to call it underscore HTTP, and the type for this is HTTP. Remember this shorthand syntax that we discussed earlier in this video series. Basically, this is going to create a private field for this class with name underscore HTTP. It also creates a constructor parameter with the same name, and then it initializes the private field with the constructor parameter. To reduce the amount of code that we have to write to do something so common, TypeScript has provided us with this shorthand syntax. We can now use this private field underscore HTTP to issue web service calls over HTTP. Now, notice this employee service class has an injected dependency. It has a dependency on this injected HTTP service. So now this @injectable decorator is mandatory. If we don't have a dependency on this HTTP service, then we don't have an injected dependency. In that case, we may omit this @injectable decorator. But Angular recommends to always use this @injectable decorator on a service class for consistency and future proof. Next, we can use this private field underscore HTTP to issue web service calls. So we can now get rid of this hard-coded data. This dot underscore HTTP dot get. Now look at the IntelliSense. Look at what this get method returns. It returns an observable of response. We'll discuss what an observable is in just a bit, but let's first import observable from RxJS. Next, let's specify the URL to which we want to issue the GET request. We know this is the URL of our ASP.NET Web API service that returns us the list of employee objects. So let's specify this URL right here as part of this GET method. Now again, if we look at the IntelliSense of this method, notice it returns observable of response. Observable of response is not that useful to us. We know this URL returns an array of iEmployee objects, right? So I'm going to change the return type to observable of iEmployee, like that. Now, if you look at the return type of this get method, it is observable of response. And if you look at the return type of our getEmployees method, we changed it to observable of iEmployee array. So we need to convert response to iEmployee array. To do that transformation, we're going to make use of an operator provided by RxJS, and that operator is map operator. So let's include the required import statement for importing the map operator from RxJS, and then we are going to chain the map operator to the get method like this, and we are going to pass the response that this get method returns. Right, look at the return type of this get method. It is observable of response. So let's pass this response to this map operator. Basically, the argument for this map operator is an arrow function. We are going to use that arrow function to transform the response to iEmployee array. So let's specify first the parameter that we want to pass. I'm going to call the parameter response. Again, if you look at the return type of this get method is observable of response. So first let's import this response from Angular HTTP. So along with HTTP, let's also import response, and the type for this parameter that we are passing to the arrow function, let's set that to response, because that's what this get method is giving us. The get method is giving us observable of response. That response we are passing to the map operator, and this arrow function right here is going to convert this response to an array of iEmployee objects. First, let's get the JSON out of the response, and then let's use the typecasting operator, and then we want to typecast the response to iEmployee array. So the map operator right here, taking in the response and transforming it to iEmployee array, which satisfies observable of iEmployee, the return type that we have specified for our getEmployees method. So here is that same code which issues a GET request to our remote web service, and notice our service returns an observable. So let's now understand what is an observable. An observable is an asynchronous pattern. In this pattern we have an observable and an observer. This observable emits data items or notifications over a period of time, and the observers, also called as subscribers, can subscribe to the observable. When subscribing, the observers specifies a callback function, and that callback function of the observer, also called as subscriber, is notified whenever this observable emits data items, and within that function we will write code to handle the data items emitted by the observable. And as you can see from this diagram, an observable can have multiple observers, that is subscribers. Anybody who is interested in the data emitted by the observable can observe the observable, meaning subscribe to the observable. When they subscribe, they specify a callback function. Within that function we have code to handle the data emitted by the observable. It's as simple as that. So if we relate this to our example, in our case this employee service returns an observable, so it becomes an observable, and any component which needs this employee data is going to be the observer, also called as subscriber. And let's say, for example, within our application, within our employee list component, we need employees data, so that is going to be the observer, subscriber, and that component is going to subscribe to the observable returned by this service. And when we are subscribing from our employee list component to this service, we are going to specify a callback function, and whenever this function returns an observable of iEmployee objects, the subscriber, the observer, in our case employee list component, is going to consume that, and we have a callback function there which is going to handle the data returned by this observable. So our next step naturally is to subscribe to the observable returned by our employee service from employee list component. So let's see how to subscribe to an observable. Now let's open our employee list component, which is going to be the observer, that is the subscriber. Notice within the ng-on-init method, we are issuing a request to the employee service, which returns the observable. And if you look at the IntelliSense for this getEmployees method, notice it returns observable of iEmployee. And if you look at this property, it is iEmployee array. So you can't bind observable of iEmployee directly to this property like this. Because this service returns an observable, we have to subscribe to the observable. And to subscribe to the observable, we use the subscribe method like that. Notice we are chaining the subscribe method to getEmployees method, which returns an observable. And remember, when we subscribe to the observable, we also specify a callback function. We specify that callback function as a parameter to the subscribe method. So we can specify that as a arrow function or a regular function. I'm going to use an arrow function. So this arrow function is going to receive employee data. So I'm going to name that parameter employee data. You can give it any meaningful name you want. And what do we want to do with that employee data? As and when the observable returns employee data, I want to use that data to populate employees property. So I simply say this dot employees equals employee data, whatever data the callback function receives from the observable. And we don't need this assignment here anymore because we are using the callback function, which is notified when the observable emits an array of iEmployee objects. This parameter is going to receive that data, and we are using that to bind to employees property. So to subscribe to an observable, we just need one line. Use the subscribe method and then specify the callback function as a parameter to that subscribe method, and that callback function receives data from the observable. And within this callback function, in our case, we are binding it to employees property. At the moment, we only specified one argument to the subscribe method. If you look at this subscribe method, it actually has 3 parameters. So let's look at that from IntelliSense. So if you look at the subscribe method, notice the third overloaded version. It has got 3 callback methods that we can specify. This first method is the method that is called when an observable emits an item, and that's what we have specified at the moment right here. The second method is called onError. So as the name implies, this method is notified when there is an error. So this callback method is called when there is an error processing our request. And we have the third method. This is called onCompleted. This method is called when observable emits the last item. Remember, an observable emits data items, a sequence of items over a period of time. In our case, however, the observable emits just one item, that is an array of iEmployee objects. But if you have an observable which emits data items, that is a sequence of items over a period of time, then when the observable emits the last data item, that's when this onCompleted method is called. In our case, it emits only one item, that is an array of iEmployee objects. That's when this onNext method is called, and because we don't have any other items the observable is emitting, immediately following that it also calls onCompleted. We haven't specified onError, onCompleted as arguments to the subscribe method. In our upcoming videos, we'll discuss how to handle errors using onError callback method. So with all these changes in place, let's run our application by pressing Ctrl F5. Notice the web page doesn't display any data. Let's launch Browser Developer Tools and investigate what's going on. Now, if you look at this error right here, look at what it says: cannot read property length of undefined. And we have this error within this method, get total employees count, within our employee list component. So let's look at that method. So we have that method right here, get total employees count, and we have just one line within that method. It's trying to compute the length of employees array. And here within ng-on-init, we are assigning this property with the data returned by the service. So what's happening here is, by the time the service has the opportunity to initialize this property, we are trying to read length property of the employees object. So that's why we get this error, cannot read property length of undefined. So what do we want to do? We want to delay the call to this method get total employees count until this ng on init had the opportunity to initialize this property. And the way we do that is by using structural directive ngf. And if you look at where we are calling this method, we are calling this within our employee list component HTML. So here we have the employee count component. We are binding get total employees count to all property, the input property. So we want to delay the initialization of this employee count component, and to do that we can use our structural directive ngf, and we specify our employees property. So basically we are saying, until this property is not null or it is not undefined, don't initialize this employee count component. So let's save these changes and reload our web page. Notice now we see a different error. Read this carefully. Look at what it says. XML HTTP request cannot load this URL. No access control allow origin header is present on the requested resource. Origin, this URL, is therefore not allowed access. We get this error because our Angular application and our Web API project, they are present in two different projects. This is our Angular project and this is our Web API project. Because they are present in two different projects, they are hosted at two different port numbers. So this is our Web API project. Look at the port number 31324. And this is our Angular application. And look at the port number for this one, 33972. Because they are present across two different port numbers, they violate the browser's same origin policy. And the browser blocks this request for security reasons. So to make this work, all we have to do is include a setting within web.config file of our Web API service. Let me paste that setting within the web.config file of our Web API project. So under system.webserver, let's include this setting. So let's look at what the setting says. So basically we are including that header access control allow origin, and I'm setting it to star. And we basically want to set the headers to content type and methods to all the methods, get, post, put, etc. Now if you're not clear on what these settings are, we discuss them in great detail in parts 14 and 15 of our Web API tutorial. In that tutorial we also discuss the browser same origin policy and cross origin resource sharing. Please watch those two videos. So I'm not going to go into great details here. And when we set this access control allow origin to star, then that basically means any application can issue a cross-domain request to this Web API service. But if you want to restrict to only your application, so if you want to allow only this Angular application to issue a cross-domain request, then you can specify the port number at which this application is running, that is the domain at which this application is running. In our case, our Angular application domain is this one, localhost 33972, so we can specify that right here, or you can also use star. So basically now we are saying only allow this Angular application cross-domain request to this Web API service. So let's save all these changes and reload our web page. Notice now we see the data as expected and the application also works as before. While we are here, let me also show you another thing. Let's rebuild our solution. Notice within the status bar you can see rebuild all succeeded. Now let's issue a request from our web page. Now this is our first request after we have rebuilt the solution, and look at what the message says. It says no employees to display, but that's not true. If you look at our database table, we have got employees in there. So this message right here is misleading. We are actually waiting here for the service to load data because we have rebuilt the solution. It's taking some time to JIT compile it, and we are actually waiting here to for the service to produce data. So that message, no employees to display, is misleading while we are actually waiting for the employees to load. So a much better message would have been loading employees, please wait. So let's see how to fix that. within employee list component, I'm going to include another tr, and look at the message we have here: loading data, please wait. And notice this ngif structural directive, ngif not employees. So basically, if employees property is not truthy, meaning if it is null or undefined, that means we are actually waiting for the service call to return with data and initialize this property. So during that wait period, we want this message to be displayed: loading data, please wait. And when the service call returns with data, this tr disappears and the employee's data show up. And look at this tr right here. This displays this message: no employees to display. And when do we want this tr to show up? When the employee's property is truthy, meaning when it is initialized, and when the length is 0, meaning we don't have any employee objects within that array to display. That means we really don't have employees. That's when we want to display this message: no employees to display. So with all these changes, let's give our solution another rebuild. Within the status bar, we can see rebuild all succeeded. So let's reissue a request from the browser. Notice while we are waiting for the service to load data, it displays this message: loading data, please wait. So at this moment, the service is busy being JIT compiled, and when the service returns with data, it's going to initialize this property employees, and when that happens, this tr disappears and the employees data show up. We are still waiting for the service to return with data. Notice as and when the data is available, that message disappeared and we have the employees data displayed. Now let's truncate this employees table, and now we don't have any employees within our employees table. So now let's reissue the request to the browser. Now we expect the message to be no employees to display. There we go. The application is working as expected. Thank you for listening and have a great day.